Sup, Creepo? I'm Leon, the Paperback Maniac, coming at you with my top 10 favorite vintage horror books read in 2019. I actually made one of these videos last year and had a lot of fun kind of going back and looking over the books I'd read and reviewed on the channel. I thought it was a nice little retrospective, and I thought it'd allow me to kind of share my personal taste with you guys and recommend some books that I, personally found enjoyable and entertaining to read. Now, I need to make clear that this is a favorites list, not a best of list. Favorites lists are, of course, a lot more subjective, and I think just usually more interesting than, books or lists that state the best of something, right? Because they are unique to the person making the list, and they can convey a person's own, personal taste. And so, my baseline when I was judging these books, it was really looking at entertainment value. That's really the common thread, I would say, among these. None of these books were ever in contention of winning any awards. That's not what they're about, but they are definitely fun books, and that's a word that will probably come up a lot in this video. Books that I just enjoyed spending time with, that I had a blast reading. Books that had me grinning from ear to ear, and books that felt like comfort reads to me, and pieces of entertainment that I would place, on the same level as like my Scream Factory Blu-rays, and things that I might want to revisit in the future because of, how fun they were. So, without further ado, we'll get into it. Now, before the top 10 list, I do have top 3 most disappointing books from 2019. So we'll start with that. I'm just going to take a quick sip of coffee. Okay, so I looked high and low, actually, for my number 3 most disappointing read. I couldn't not find it anywhere, unfortunately, so I can't display the gorgeous cover art to you guys, but it is Malsum by Gerald John O'Hara. And it was published by Avon in 1981, and it's basically the story of an evil Native American sorcerer who possesses a deer in order to exact revenge on the white folk that had killed his sons and imprisoned him for many years. Now, that does sound amazing, right? And, despite having, a really cool central premise and an amazing villain in this stag, this evil possessed deer, Malsum, which is described super cool with its, like, gnarled antlers and its, like, tears and rips in its hide and, like, the bullet holes piercing its hide and, like, the red and festering skin. Really cool villain. However, this book was just way too long. It spent way too much time on the white protagonist family and their story and all their melodrama. Had some unlikable characters, including one central character who I actively wanted to see die, and he's supposed to be like the hero. But I thought it was not executed very well. While I was reading it, I kept thinking how much more satisfying it would have worked as a story in the hands of someone like James Herbert or John Halkin, or any of those Brits that were writing the great sort of like animal mayhem books in the 70s and 80s. But I thought it was a miss overall, and so unfortunately, kind of a disappointment. My number 2 biggest disappointment of the year has got to go to Abomination by Michael C. Norton. This book was published by Leisure in 1987. And this is a book that came highly recommended to me from a number of people. And it's a book that is pretty esteemed and, loved, I think, in the horror community. For my part, unfortunately, just could not really get into it that much. I'm not really a huge fan of these kind of sprawling Bildungsroman type narratives where we follow kind of like the life of one character over the course of many years. I find those books usually to have a lot too much telling and not enough showing. And, and this one definitely does feel like an biographical debut novel in which the author just put as much of his life into it as he could. The horror, when it does come, is not bad per se. In fact, there are some cool little horror scenes here and there, including one scene of bloody carnage at a high school reunion, which was pretty amazing. But ultimately, very little payoff for a book that's 400 pages. And yeah, it was just kind of a miss for me. So, and then my number one most disappointing read of 2019 definitely has to go to The Voice of the Clown by Brenda Brown Canary. This book was published by Avon in 1982, and probably the most overhyped vintage horror novel ever. Right? I mean, I was super stoked to read this thing after, reading about its praises in Paperbacks from Hell, and add to that the fact that it is an evil kid book. That's a subgenre that I really love. And so I was very hyped on this. But, despite some solid writing and a small handful of what the fuck scenes, this book is just really poorly paced. I thought, the chapters were way too long. It had a lot of repetition. I found the characters to be shrill and hateful, and I felt like, the horror in this always just took a backseat to sort of the ham-fisted melodrama. And yeah, it was pretty disappointing for me. So yeah, I did not care too much for The Voice of the Clown. All right, now we'll get into my top three runners up. So I'm going to take another sip of coffee here. Okay, so my number three runner up is Demonic Color by Pauline Dunn. Now, this book was published by Zebra in 1990, and this mean-spirited little shocker is about a glowing toxic cloud that basically causes complete breakdown of the body's tissues and vital organs, basically making like a person dissolve within himself, and then also makes the bodies like secrete this toxin, which can go on to like harm people. And no one is safe from this thing, this cloud. Kids, babies, mothers, the elderly, anyone can go in the most horrific fashion. And I have to say, I mean, this book contains some of the grossest, goriest deaths I've ever read. Plenty of splitting and oozing bodies just rendered in the most graphic way possible. So gorehounds definitely take note, and I think it's worth it just for the deaths. If you want something really kind of nasty and gruesome, this is the book for you. Zebra in top form here. Okay, my number two runner-up is Satan's Servant by B.W. Bettine. This book was published by Paperjacks in 1984. And I thought this one was just a fun and well-executed take on the standard sort of evil in a small town book. In this case, an amateur occultist conjures up all of the nastiest demons from hell, and they become unleashed on this in this New Mexico town. And I thought it was good, well done, well written. I thought it had a good sort of structure to it. It had likable characters, good deaths. Although I felt it could have maybe pushed the envelope a little more, because I've read, this subgenre, it has some really sort of extreme examples. People like R. Patrick Gates and Layman have done this, and I thought this one could have gone a little further. But overall, very solid effort from Mr. Bettine, and definitely worth checking out. And then my number one runner-up is The Cartoonist by Sean Costello. And this book was published by Pocket in 1990, and I had a lot of fun with this one. I loved the titular villain there. I thought he was a really creepy and enigmatic character. Definitely would have liked to see more of him. I wish he featured more in the book. But like a lot of pocket titles, this one definitely has stronger writing than most and definitely takes more time to develop its characters so that you do actually care by the time, all of the mayhem starts to happen and you actually want to see them get out of there. And I thought this was really executed well. And Sean Costello actually is a practicing physician, and that you can definitely tell he's an educated person. Definitely, lent an air of verisimilitude to the story, and also just the writing was better than what I usually read. This one, highly recommended to people who like late '80s, early '90s horror. A fun time for sure. So that's The Cartoonist. All right, now getting into the top 10. All right, so we're going to start with my number 10 favorite, and that would be Blood Sabbath by Lee Clark. This book was published by Zebra in 1991. And, when I talk about entertainment value and just sheer glee when it comes to reading, this is a good case in point. This is just a really fun, gory, early 90s teen horror novel. It feels very LA as well, and it's sort of its cheery occult mysticism. But this one is kind of like the equivalent of that USA Up All Night flick you watched with your friends back when you were having a sleepover in 1991. It's sort of like the literary equivalent of a Friday night pizza with extra cheese. Just a lot of fun. Not as good as Lee Clark's first novel, The Feeding, but definitely high up there when it comes to just like sheer entertainment value. So I really had a blast with Blood Sabbath. So that's number 9. Okay, that's number 10. Number 9. Here we have Night Flyer by Christopher Fahey. This book was published by Jove in 1982. Probably the least quote-unquote horror book on this list, and therefore, I probably could have even placed this one a little higher. I thought it was just a fantastic sort of depiction of adolescent anguish and sorrow and loneliness. For most of the book, it's kind of a coming of age fantasy drama about this, just really sad and lonely kid whose only escape from the travails of adolescent existence is to just leave his body and kind of go out and fly around the town. I thought it was really executed well. I thought the prose was well done. The characterization was top notch. I hadn't really cared for an adolescent character this much since reading The Voice of the Night by Dean Koontz. And for fans of that book, I would highly recommend that you check this one out because it's similarly, effective in kind of exploring that adolescent age and sort of the terrors and fears that come along with it. So Night Flyer, definitely strongly recommended. Okay, my number 8 favorite book of 2019 is Satan's Mistress by Brian McNaughton. Now, this book was published by Carlyle in 1978. And this ended up being one of my favorite books that I read last summer as part of my Satanic Summer review series. Just essentially, it's about a teenager who's slowly being possessed by his evil wizard ancestor. And, we've got stuff like the Necronomicon, another Lovecraft mythos. We've got some good old-fashioned incest. We've got resurrected flesh-eating monsters. And it's all done very, very well. Very well written. You can tell this was, like the 70s. Sometimes I feel like had a little higher caliber when it came to like just prose and execution. I thought the characters were well developed. It has great dialogue among the characters, and it's solid humor as well. Which all that comes together, and I'm very, very happy to have discovered this guy and looking forward to reading his other sort of like Satan, quote unquote Satan books that don't really have anything to do with Satan. But that's Satan's Mistress. All right, number 7. We've got Nightbait by Philip Straker, who, of course, is Edward Lee. This book was published by Zebra in 1982. And I was always curious about this obscure little curio for the simple fact that it was Edward Lee's first published novel, and also the fact that he, is trying to bury it and he doesn't like to talk about it at all. And after reading it, I'm not really sure why he's so embarrassed about it. I found it to be an exceedingly entertaining, entertaining in a borderline offensive and sleazy, kind of like early 80s grindhouse way. But this is just great. I mean, we've got a sex-crazed necrophiliac killer who's stalking the neon-drenched urban porno districts that we don't exist anymore, and his name is the Electrocutionist. And it's just fun. We've got great descriptions of those old kind of grimy porno districts. We've got great descriptions of violence, which definitely show hints of what Lee was later to become kind of known for. I really enjoyed this, and as I said in my review for this book, if you dig kind of like early 80s sleazy grindhouse fare like Maniac or the New York Ripper or Vice Squad, then this blood's for you for sure. So that's Nightbait. Okay, number 6, we are taking a look at Doppelganger by Eric Higgs. This book was published by St. Martin's Press in 1987. It's probably the least known book in this entire list, which is a damn shame. I thought this book was expertly paced, had great characterization, a really cool high concept of kind of like this meek man's id manifesting itself in the form of a murderous doppelganger that goes out on to sort of like act out the psyche's most sort of deep-seated feelings, and of course to devastating consequences. But this is a book that no one ever really talks about, and that's a shame because it's really well done, and like a lot of SMP titles, extremely well written, and just executed really well. Like structure and plot is tight. I really enjoyed it, so I highly recommend seeking out Doppelganger. All right, cracking into the top 5 here. Our number 5, we've got Grim Reapings by R. Patrick Gates. This book was published by Pinnacle in 2006. It is a sequel to the infamous Grim Memorials, a book which Onyx put out in 1990. And I found that these books by R. Patrick Gates are definitely like love it or hate it. I feel like there's not a whole lot of middle ground. A lot of that may have to do with sort of like a person's tolerance for graphic depictions of child death. But if you don't mind that or can get over that, highly recommend this series. I absolutely adored both Grim Memorials and Grim Reapings. I love Eleanor Grimm. I love that character. I think she's just like a fantastic, this kind of like hyper-sexual, scary, funny, wicked witch who, sacrifices kids and eats their flesh in order to be, to live forever. But this one is basically like a teenage possession story, another teenage possession story, but with Gates's usual flair. It's just beyond the pale, over the top, in your face. This one definitely has a lot more, sexy stuff in it, though there are some gruesome bits in there as well. The horror is often kept cheesy, never really scary, but, it's just fun. It's got a great finale, supernatural finale that pulls out all the stops. I'm a big fan of Gates, and I highly recommend, all of the stuff that I've read of his so far. Okay. Number 4, we've got The Book of the Damned by D.A. or Deborah Fowler. This book was published by Pocket in 1993. I love Deborah Fowler. And I love the fact that she seems to be having a little bit of resurgence in 2019. I mean, this time last year when I did my list favorite books of 2018, her novel What's Wrong with Valerie was my number one. And I remember sort of bemoaning the fact that she was completely out of print. You could not find her stuff anywhere. And since then, that has changed, actually, because I believe What's Wrong with Valerie has been reissued, and some of her other works as well. So it seems like people are finally starting to discover her, and that is great because, she definitely deserves it. I think she's one of the stronger horror writers of this halcyon era. Here, she seems to just be having a lot of fun writing, just kind of relentless, balls to the wall supernatural horror novel with a great central premise. That being, what if the horror novel that you read starts to kind of invade your life, and then suddenly you start living the horrors yourself? Just a really cool, kind of high concept idea. I mean, this book really did everything that I want vintage horror paperback to do. I love it when books sort of blur the lines between reality and fantasy, when they kind of revel in that nightmare dream logic and just sort of like go all out with these really kind of freaky and surreal horror set pieces. And this one also has a sense of humor, which I appreciate a lot. And I would actually add this along with Blood Sabbath as another one of those like USA Up All Night type reads. Definitely has that sort of that feel. It's very early 90s, and just a great entertainment. So just order a pizza and enjoy The Book of the Damned by Deborah Fowler. Great book. Okay, top three now. My number three favorite vintage read of 2019. It's got to go to Mirror by Graham Masterton. This book was published by Tor in 1988. This one really has just got everything you want in a late 80s supernatural horror novel. Like The Book of the Damned by Deborah Fowler, this one's got a great central premise, really good storytelling, which, by the way, lest you think that, this maniac only requires, graphic descriptions of like violence and gore to be satisfied. No, you are wrong. Storytelling always comes first. You need to have, a good idea, and it needs to be executed well. The violence and the gore, that's just like an added bonus. But writers like Graham Masterton and Deborah Fowler, the reason that they're so great is because they can give it all to you, right? A good, well-wrought story in addition to all the fun, details and stuff like that. And I do feel like sometimes that is one of the big differences between writers of this sort of halcyon era of horror in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And some of the kind of more like current indie extreme horror writers. Sometimes I feel like some of these new guys feel like all it takes is to just be as graphic and disgusting and just string along a series of just like brutal, like bloody scenes. That's not, you need to have a story to go with it, right? Storytelling is important. And this story was a blast to read, really inventive and off the wall. And it does deliver when it comes to like those kind of like graphic, gory set pieces as well as the fun story. So Mirror definitely gets a recommendation. Okay, my number two favorite vintage read of the year, it's got to go to Death Song by Douglas Borton. This book was published by Onyx in 1989. And again, like the last two books I just discussed in particular, this one delivers all the goods. I was smiling from ear to ear the entire time I read this. Loved every single page of it. It really just gave me everything I wanted. This one, it's another great late 80s LA horror novel. Super fast paced. I mean, this thing hits the ground running with bloody skid marks and just does not let up. It's got fun characters, great set pieces. I mean, come on, a guy dies from instantaneous reverse evolution and a myriad of other just fun and inventive, gruesome set pieces. It's really just got it all. Douglas Borton is really kind of cementing himself along with, Fowler and some of these other guys as one of my go-to favorites. I've enjoyed every single one of his books I've read so far, and yeah, looking forward to reading more, hopefully in 2020. All right, and my number one favorite vintage horror book of the year. Don't know if this is going to be surprising to anyone, but it's gotta be Cold Front by Barry Hammond. Now, this book was published by Signet in 1982. This book was a total surprise to me. This was one that I had heard good things about. And, it's a short book, which had appealed to me. I read this, I think this was my first read of 2019. It is the perfect winter read. It's got one of the best winter settings that I've ever read. Just a great snowy, Canadian setting. I have to say, like, the characters are all kind of like these hardened, roughneck men who are trying to dispose of a body. So they're not the most likable characters. It's not that easy to relate to them. But what this book does have is just some insane descriptions, including some just amazing dream imagery and very vivid and wild dream imagery, not unlike some of R. Patrick Gates' stuff, actually, and similar to Gates, not sort of afraid to conflate sex and violence, and not afraid to go to some kind of weird and gross places. But this book, I was super taken aback and just bowled over by this book. And I do apologize. It's not lost on me that my number one favorite vintage horror read of the year is virtually inaccessible at this point. I recently checked again. Right now there are no copies for this thing available online anywhere. But don't be deterred. Keep looking, because as we all know, things turn around. But definitely have this on your radar, and be on the lookout. Who knows, it might even be reissued at some point. I know that last year Valancourt Books, they've been re-releasing a lot of these paperbacks from hell. They actually used this cover for their reissue of The Spirit by Thomas Page. And, it's clear they used this one because this cover is just a lot cooler than the original cover art for The Spirit. But don't be fooled, though. It's not Cold Front by Barry Hammond, even though it has this cover. But, maybe somewhere down the lines it'll get re-released, or maybe there'll be an ebook or something. Or maybe you'll just look out one of these days when you're in the shop and come across it and buy it for $2.50, right? That's the dream. That's what we're always looking for. So yeah, definitely Cold Front. I'm putting this at my number one just because it needs to be, it needs to be in the conversation. It's a shame that it's so obscure. Hopefully that will change soon. But I greatly enjoyed it. So that is it, guys. That is my top 10 favorite vintage horror books that I read in 2019, with some runners-up and some disappointing reads as well. Hope you guys enjoyed watching that. Of course, as always, if you've read any of those books, feel free to drop a line and shoot me a comment on them. I think that overall, 2019 was a pretty solid year reading wise. There were some good books in there. Definitely, I'm definitely looking forward to what 2020 brings. And so, I hope you guys all stick around and come back for more fun vintage horror book reviews in 2020. And yeah, thanks for watching, guys. Happy New Year. And if you, like I said, have any insights into any of these books, always feel free to drop a line. Love communicating with you guys. But until next time, I'll see you later. Peace out.